everyone, and welcome to episode 42, the final episode in this series on ecology. If you've been listening to the whole series from the beginning, you heard me introduce ecology as a field of study, as a fundamental aspect of the biological sciences. Then I explored ecology at all of its levels, from the behavior of the individual organism to the behaviors of a collective, of populations. Then I explored the species interactions that take place at the community level, followed by entire ecosystems and their integration into the greater biosphere. If you just finished listening to that most recent episode, you'll remember that I ended it by talking about water cycling and nutrient cycling, and how these geochemical processes connect all life on Earth. In this episode, I'm going to talk about the biodiversity of the planet, what that means, and how humans can work to save and preserve the biodiversity in the complex ecosystems that we have today. Alright, so the most fundamental question, then, what's biodiversity? The root words give it away. Bio, meaning life, and diversity, so basically means the diversity of life, or the variety of different kinds of organisms that can exist in a given habitat, or an ecosystem, or on the entire planet. Biodiversity is relatively low in deserts, polar regions, high-altitude steppe, and the barren expanses of open ocean. All of these areas get too little of some critical resource, which limits its habitability and reduces the number of species that can live there. For instance, deserts get too little water, and they get too much heat. Polar regions get too little heat, and in many cases, much less water than most other areas. While the open ocean has lots of water and sunlight, but little to no nutrients. Coral reefs, in contrast, are tightly concentrated areas in the oceans with extremely high biodiversity and stunningly complex community ecologies. Reefs are literally like explosions of life, piercing an otherwise barren, sandy ocean floor. Biodiversity can be understood at three levels of organization, or three levels of magnification. At the smallest level, there's DNA. The diversity of genes in a gene pool is genetic diversity. It's important for populations and species to maintain a healthy level of genetic diversity, because the more alleles and traits that are present in a population, the more likely that population is to survive a threat, like predation or a disease. If you imagine a population of organisms that all have really similar genes, and thus low genetic diversity, the entire population is more susceptible to disease. If a pathogen can penetrate the defenses of one host, then that pathogen has effectively nullified the genes that produce viable immune proteins and defensive structures. The pathogen has nullified the organism's defensive capacity. And if all of the individuals in the population have the same genes, they have the same defenses. And this means that a pathogen that can infect one will easily infect the entire group and can possibly kill them all. You can contrast this with an example from medieval Europe, where some of the people who survived the bubonic plague had a random genetic predisposition towards resisting it. Whatever trait they happened to possess, which might be something as innocuous as part of a biomolecule on the surface of their cell that's just bent in a different direction, and it makes them a little less likely to be infected than those without the genetic trait. And so, this group of bubonic plague survivors, or this portion of the survivors, they had gone through a bottleneck event that had killed off a huge portion of the people with no genetic resistance. Because of this, those who did have that resistance, and who survived the bubonic plague, were now a much larger portion of the total surviving population than they were before the plague. This genetic resistance to bubonic plague persists today in many of the living descendants of those particular survivors. I worry sometimes about the genetic diversity of our agricultural crops, which seems to be uncomfortably low. Monoculture cultivation literally means that entire swaths of land are used to grow a single species. And in many cases, these single species are the same, it's that same species that gets sold around the planet, sold and grown and consumed in supermarkets and, the whole nine yards. And so if a disease comes along that could ravage one of these plants, one of these really important agricultural crops, it could easily destroy an entire crop, like a whole field could go to waste. And this creates It's just tremendous agricultural and financial loss. And so this kind of introduces the next level of magnification of biodiversity, which is species diversity. This is the number and ecological value of all of the species in a habitat, or in a genetic lineage. Humans, for example, have had numerous cousin lineages split off from the larger Homo branch, which itself split off from the ancestor species of chimps and bonobos about 5 to 6 million years ago. As far as we're aware, all of our cousin lineages, like Neanderthals and the Denisovans, they've all gone extinct. In that regard, the Homo lineage is species poor. There's a single species left, the Homo sapien, us. And if we go extinct somehow, the lineage of the Homo genus will be gone forever. On the other hand, there are lineages that are species rich, or lineages that have a large number of descendant species, all of them evolutionary cousins of one another. So, for example, there are 5 species of cow that make up the Bos genus. There's 285 species of squirrels in the family Sciuridae. There's 3,600 species of snake in the suborder Serpentis, and there's around 10,000 species of birds. There are some lineages with such huge species richness that we haven't even cataloged them all. We haven't even discovered them all. There's more than 12,000 named species of ants out of an estimated 22,000. There's 35,000 named species of orchids, and the largest group by far are beetles, which have over 350,000 species. But species diversity isn't just the raw number of species in a lineage, or the number of species living in a habitat. It's also the ecological value that each species provides to their community. This is important to understand because it reinforces the point that life is in continual flux with all other life around it, perpetually. So the habits of one species have been shaped by evolution to fit into a greater community, where all of the habits and behaviors of dozens, if not hundreds or thousands of species all kind of interlock in this giant chemical orchestra. This value obviously varies from species to species and habitat to habitat, but ultimately some species have more ecological value than others. A particular species of fly may be one of several thousand species of fly in a given area, and of those thousands of species, they may be barely any different at all than hundreds of others. And so if that particular fly species were to go extinct, there might not be that much effect. There's hundreds of other fly species that perform the same ecological services and functions that one particular fly species did. Other similar fly species might just fill the empty niche, and the animals that ate them would be none the wiser. On the other hand, when you're talking about a larger organism like a tree or a bear, or some kind of species that provides a kind of valuable ecological service, these would obviously leave a larger imbalance in their ecosystem should they go extinct. Trees, for example, are hugely important for their ecosystems. They literally form the physical architecture needed by other species, like mosses, lizards, monkeys, birds, squirrels, and everything else that dwells in or on the tree. Apex predators are also important, because they typically regulate the size of herbivore populations. Without predators to cull them, the populations of herbivores grow wildly as they reproduce with no fear of predation, and they ultimately eat up all of the available vegetation, and they just destroy their habitats. This brings me to the third level of biodiversity, which exists as the diversity within an ecosystem, and how that diversity provides necessary ecological services and moves chemicals and nutrients through their various cycles. Consider nitrogen-fixing bacteria, which provide a critically important service for plants. These bacteria take molecular nitrogen in the atmosphere, and they break the triple bond that connects the two nitrogen molecules. This is called fixing the nitrogen, so they're nitrogen fixers. And this creates nitrogenous compounds that are more bioavailable to the plants. Where plants can't break that triple bond in molecular nitrogen, you get a nitrogen-fixing species in there, and they metabolize that molecular nitrogen into a nitrogenous compound, And that compound is much more accessible to plants. They can absorb it and break it down and use that nitrogen to grow their tissues. If an ecosystem loses the few bacterial species that it has with the genes necessary to fix nitrogen, then that function would disappear. Species that could fix nitrogen would disappear. There's no organisms left to break down molecular nitrogen into a more accessible format. And the result of this is that plants can no longer rely on those bacteria as a source of nitrogen. But because plants get most, if not all, of their nitrogen from these bacteria, their disappearance would really screw over the plants. The plants in the habitat would likely die, and the ecosystem would experience the catastrophic collapse of its primary producers. Nitrogen cycling would grind to a halt in the ecosystem, and the food web would be so disrupted without the primary producers that it would be effectively destroyed. This example shows how all of these levels of biodiversity are integrated, how all of life is integrated and how it's all connected. You have the genes in the bacteria that code for the proteins that fix the nitrogen, so genetic diversity. You have the bacteria species that can do this, species diversity. And you have the upstream ecological effects of their nitrogen fixation on all the other species around them, so that's ecosystem diversity. This also ties together everything that I've covered in all of the episodes before this. The biochemicals I talked about in Series 1 make the cells that I talked about in Series 2. And the genes I talked about in Series 3 create the organisms, in combination with the cells, create the organisms that get shaped through evolution, which I talked about in Series 4. I talked about the divergence and diversity of species that propagated from these forces in Series 5 and 6. And in this series, number 7, I've been talking about how everything interacts together. I really can't emphasize enough how all living things, including you and me, are connected really deeply on a fundamental chemical basis with all other living things around us. There's about 1.5 million species that have been named and cataloged. Only some of these have been studied, and a relatively small portion of them have been studied extensively. But it's estimated that many millions of species exist that have yet to be described, named, or even discovered. So, where are all of these species? They're not dispersed evenly across the planet. That much is obvious. You can recall in a previous episode when I talked about the density of an ecosystem, or just a few minutes ago in this episode when I talked about species richness. The density of life is highest in the geographic areas where the environmental conditions are optimal for life. In the far north, across the vast expanses of taiga and tundra that cover Siberia, there's relatively little life. There's only a few species. The areas are species poor, and the few species that do live in these areas aren't very concentrated. They're dispersed across this huge landscape. That's why you don't really see these giant collections of trees. Like, you don't see giant tree stands. Depending on how far north you get, you won't see any trees at all. They kind of just stop, and the only vegetation on the landscape is grasses and mosses and maybe the occasional shrub or bush. The reason everything is so sparse up here is because that's all that the land can support. There isn't that much light, and most of the year it's very cold and often very dry, and all of this stuff makes it hard for plants to grow. When the primary producers of an ecosystem are struggling, they can't support a very large population of primary, secondary, or tertiary consumers. There simply isn't enough chemical energy in the ecosystem to support this. This is also true in the open desert, where it's too hot and too dry for most plants to grow, and for most animals to tolerate. Some species can, but just like the polar regions, these desert-dwelling species are few in number, and they're scattered widely across the landscape. In contrast, there are regions like the Amazon rainforest in South America, or the Congo River Basin in Central Africa, or the jungles of Southeast Asia. All of these regions are hot because they get a lot of light from the sun, but there's enough humidity in the air to moderate the temperature, so it never gets too hot like it does in the Sahara or Saudi Arabia or the Australian outback. This combination of ample sunlight, steady annual temperatures, and high humidity and rainfall, it all creates an environment that's prime for life, that's optimal for life, and so life grows really vigorously. Life grows really fast, and it comes in dense. These more habitable regions are extremely dense with life. You have trees that can grow really close together, and there's all manner of smaller plants that fill in the spaces in between. And there's all manner of animals that live in, on, and around these plants, using them as shelter or food or even as part of their life cycle. Because of this, more than half of all of the species on planet Earth exist in tropical jungles where the conditions for life are optimal. Biodiversity can be studied by looking at species richness, which, as I've said, is basically the raw number of different species in a region, as well as the value that they provide ecologically. And it can also be studied by looking at the number of endemic species in a region. Endemic species are those species that live in that region and nowhere else on Earth. So areas with a higher count of endemic species generally have a greater biodiversity. In fertile tropical areas like the Pacific Islands of Oceania and the Andes Mountains of South America, the number of endemic species of birds, for example, is really high, and this correlates directly to the total biodiversity of the regions, which are both quite high too. Across the planet, there are countless regions with high biodiversity, or regions with endemic species found nowhere else. There are areas where the biodiversity of other regions overlaps, and these become a kind of locus for unique and complex species interactions that are also found nowhere else. Biodiversity is a critically important factor in ecology, in the health of ecosystems and habitats. If you have a complex ecosystem with lots of biodiversity, with lots of species of plants and animals, you have a lot of niches. You have a lot of food sources, a lot of shelter, a lot of predators and prey, and really complex species interactions. There's likely a lot of species that play really important roles, or those that provide some really critical service or function that perpetuates the health and stability of the ecosystem. Needless to say, biodiversity is important. It's integral to the health of our habitats and ecology. But biodiversity is being threatened by human activity, by the changes that we're inducing to the planet. Mass extinction events are nature's typical tool for cleansing a landscape of life and destroying the biodiversity in a region. Meteor impacts kill off life. Volcanic eruptions kill off life. Massive wildfires and floods and outgassing events can kill off life. Uncontrolled predator activity can kill off their prey. Uncontrolled herbivore activity can kill off the plants they feed on. Diseases can wipe out species entirely, or reduce them to such a state that they can't sustain their numbers, and they're doomed to slowly die out. The number and nature of the threats to the world's biodiversity is quite high, but nature has not created an extinction force as powerful as the human species. Humans are causing extinctions at a horrifying rate, which is leading to a reduction in biodiversity unparalleled in any other time in the history of the planet. In my series on the evolutionary history of life, I talked about the 5 primary mass extinctions that have defined life on Earth. These extinctions radically altered the biodiversity present on the planet, reducing species to bottleneck conditions, if not wiping them out entirely. Those life forms that survived each event would go on to reproduce, diversify, and evolve new species, recreating the lost biodiversity over millions of years. The 6th mass extinction is ongoing right now as I speak to you through this podcast medium. Our behavior, our collective human behavior, from agriculture to medicine to industry, is having a profound effect on the biodiversity of the planet, reducing it in pretty much every case. For example, we need lumber to build our houses, so we cut down forests. But this deforestation quite literally destroys the habitats of thousands and thousands of forest-dwelling species. We're driving them out of their native habitats, into newer regions where they either can't compete very well and thus they face extinction, or where they actually thrive and they become an invasive species that wreaks havoc on the habitats they invade. We practice industry and large-scale agriculture, but these activities create pollution that destabilizes ecosystems with harmful chemicals and materials. Some of these chemicals can alter the growth or the reproduction of vulnerable species, and some of these materials can choke or poison the animals that eat them. I've talked about microbeads before and the threat that they and other plastics pose to animal life, And you may have heard Alex Jones rant about chemicals that, and I quote, are turning the frickin' frogs gay. These are industrial and agricultural runoff, chemicals that are being washed out by rain and that kind of saturate habitats that they're not really meant to be in. If you put a fertilizer or an insecticide on your crop, and then it rains and that chemical gets washed out into a nearby swamp, all of the frogs in that swamp are now exposed to these chemicals, and it messes with their endocrine cycles, with their reproductive cycles, with their development. Even our medicines can end up polluting habitats, wherein a human takes a drug, metabolizes some of it, and excretes the rest in their waste, in their urine or feces. And when this waste is flushed down the toilet, it finds its way into rivers and streams, into bodies of water, and where some of this medicine is still biologically active, and it can then interfere in the endocrine and reproductive cycles of other organisms that happen to be in that habitat. Habitat destruction is perhaps the most obvious and widespread effect of human development. Deforestation through logging is an obvious example of habitat destruction, but it doesn't stop there. When we develop land for urban expansion, it typically involves the radical reconfiguration of the landscape. If we want to build in a swamp, we drain the swamp. If we want to build in a mountainous region, we level the mountains. If we want to redirect a river, we build a dam. And all of these things have downstream effects. They have ecological consequences. When the swamp is drained, all of the organisms that depended on that watery, swampy environment are literally left out to dry. Plants that require the swamp water are often outright doomed, as they've got pretty much no recourse to defend themselves in this scenario. Animals might fare slightly better because they can run away, but without their ideal habitat, without their food sources that live in that habitat, their chances of survival are also hugely reduced. When we level mountains to build a road, or a suburb, or whatever, we push out all of the animals that thrived in that mountain environment, like birds and goats and yaks and other organisms. And for that matter, by removing mountains, we take away all of the ecological effects that mountains have. We redirect wind patterns. We affect where rain falls, where pollen goes, where animals migrate. When we dam up a river, the river itself gets entirely redirected. All the plants downstream from the dam get starved of the water that they've come to depend on, and any fish that migrate in the stream find themselves lost. For that matter, the redirected river cuts through new habitats, often destroying them in a flush of water. If the river isn't redirected by the dam, it can build up and form a lake, and this lake comes with its own ecological ramifications. Land gets drowned, and everything living there gets drowned with it, or pushed out into less comfortable territory. In all of these ways, habitats get radically altered or outright destroyed by human activity. Sometimes we don't outright destroy a habitat, but we degrade it to such an extent that it can no longer support or propagate the species that live there. Sometimes this habitat degradation takes the form of interference, and other times it takes the form of fragmentation. The most obvious example of interference that I can think of is light pollution and sound pollution. This is most harmful for species of birds because they use both the stars and the sun to navigate, and they use songs to communicate and to attract mates. So when light pollution blocks out the stars, or it confuses birds and makes them think that the glow from a city is the sun, the birds find it difficult to navigate. Sometimes they just confuse light pollution from a city as a rising or a setting sun, and when this doesn't jive with their circadian rhythm, they get confused. Sound pollution can come from almost anything that produces a lot of noise. Heavy traffic, industrial machinery, jet engine aircraft, you name it. All of these things can frighten animals and drive them out of a particular region, or they can interfere with their mating calls. I mean, it's pretty hard to attract a mate when you can't hear them make their mating call, and when they can't hear you either. This is why there's kind of a lot of concern for the effects of sound pollution near airports or freeways. The other mechanism for habitat degradation is called fragmentation. A fragmented habitat is one that's been literally fragmented or fractured into a bunch of smaller pieces or smaller plots of land. The most obvious way that this can happen is with simple roads and highways. These strips of asphalt can cut right through a field or a forest or swampland, pretty much anything, and they divide the landscape into these irregular chunks. Terrestrial animals will, they're able to walk across the road, but depending on the level of traffic, they're often taking a risk when they try to cross. If you've driven for any appreciable length of time, you've almost certainly seen a rabbit or a deer or something try to cross the road. Perhaps they were lucky and they got away. Perhaps you turned and tried to get out of their way so you didn't hit them. But perhaps the animal wasn't so lucky and you hit and killed them. Perhaps you were really unlucky and you hit a larger animal like a bear or a moose, in which case it and you would be injured if not outright killed. Habitat fragmentation has a few kind of nuanced effects that can seriously alter the local ecology. First, consider the case of an apex predator. These organisms require a huge expanse of land to roam and hunt for their prey. When their habitat gets fragmented, the predator has that much less land that they can roam around. They're that much less likely to find food or to find a mate. The end result is a drastic reduction in the number and efficacy of the apex predator. Their prey populations will then live more or less unharassed, and they'll swell in numbers. And as I talked about before, this can have numerous serious downstream ecological effects. If you have a bunch of herbivores with no predators to cull their numbers, those herbivores will reproduce like crazy. They'll literally mate like rabbits, and they'll eat all of the available food until they just create a barren, empty landscape. Another negative consequence of habitat fragmentation is the emergence of ecological patterns called metapopulations. You see, when you have an uninterrupted habitat, just a big, uninterrupted expanse of land, it'll be inhabited by large populations that roam and swell across the landscape. But when the habitat is fragmented, the population is also fragmented. And so instead of a big group of organisms, you end up with a lot of little groups. This ecological restructuring puts species at a lot of risk for two main reasons. First, it makes the tiny metapopulations that much more susceptible to diseases and droughts and other threats to their survival. The smaller populations have less genetic diversity, and so they have less of a capacity to respond to and survive an external threat. Any kind of dangerous, random chance event like this, like a disease or an environmental change, it can come by and destroy a metapopulation really quickly, whereas a larger population would have more genetic diversity and a greater geographic distribution that would ensure their survival. Second, these smaller, isolated metapopulations suffer from really low gene flow. They've suddenly been cut off from all the rest of their species, kind of like a tiny village community isolated from the rest of civilization. The villagers, and in the case of natural ecology, these plants and animals in the metapopulation, are exposed to the dangers of inbreeding. Their fitness and their health will slowly degenerate as the isolated metapopulation is forced to interbreed through the circumstances of being shuttered in a fragmented habitat. This leads to an increasing relatedness in the mating individuals, ultimately resulting in the random loss of allelic traits, as well as a general decrease in fitness, known as inbreeding depression. All of these things make the metapopulation more susceptible to diseases and threats, and more vulnerable to extinction. Humans have also been reducing biodiversity through overexploitation, which is technically defined as the unsustainable rate of extraction of wildlife from their native habitat. This is most obvious in the oceans, where the collective effort of all the world's fishing fleets has depleted the oceans of numerous species. Some species of fish have had their numbers obliterated, and they struggle to maintain their existence, and others have just been driven to extinction. Other species have seen a huge reduction in their size, as all the large individuals have been fished out, leaving only the small individuals to reproduce and pass on their genes into the next generation. As a result of this, the average size of any given species of fish, particularly large-bodied fish like swordfish, tuna, and trout, they've all been decreasing steadily as a result of our overfishing. It's important that we understand the ways our behavior affects life on this planet and how it affects biodiversity. The biodiversity of our world is extremely important. We see greater production of biomass in areas with higher biodiversity because life helps perpetuate life. And where there's more life, like more trees, more insects, more of everything, we see more complex food webs, more genetic and species diversity that are more resistant to damage and more resistant to threats. And we see more complex species interactions that create more dynamic, responsive ecologies. This means that resources are used more efficiently. Resources are distributed more effectively. There's a greater diversity of biological services provided to the ecosystem by the various species within it. Biological communities with higher biodiversity are more resistant to drought, to disease, to wildfire, to pretty much any threat that you can think of. Biodiversity and the inherent dynamism of a wide variety of species brings a degree of stability to an ecosystem that nothing else really can. It's important that we work hard to preserve what biodiversity remains on the planet, and it's important that we try to restore biodiversity to areas where it's been reduced. One method that I'm particularly fond of is called a wildlife corridor. Land is often fragmented around cities as we build out roads and railways and other kinds of land development. And as I've described, this can impede the movement and migration of animals, and it can have many negative downstream effects. But with a wildlife corridor, these problems can be largely averted. These corridors are deliberately created and maintained biological pathways. They're like animal highways almost. You can think of it as like a bridge covered with, instead of asphalt, grass and trees. Instead of serving as a transportation route for human vehicles, the wildlife corridors give animals an avenue for transport that bypasses the structures responsible for habitat fragmentation, and it prevents them from being exposed to the inherent dangers. If you have a road that fragments a habitat, it's kind of dangerous for the animal to cross that road, because they can get hit by a car. But if you have a bridge going over the road, like a wildlife corridor, then instead of crossing the road and risking death, they can just find this wildlife corridor and safely walk across it. They're at no risk of getting hit by a car, and the fragmentation kind of is nullified almost. If you have a large road that bisects a forest and fragments it into two smaller forests, a wildlife corridor can take the form of a wide bridge or series of bridges over the roadway, wherein the animals native to the forest can cross back and forth. In this way, the effect of fragmentation is lessened, as predators can still roam around a wide expanse of land, and grazing animals can maintain their migration routes, and gene flow can still be maintained between populations that would have otherwise been separated by the interfering thing, in this case, a road. It's ideas like this that will help preserve our world's biodiversity, ideas that are elegant and aesthetic, yet functional and effective. Coming up with new ideas for maintaining and preserving biodiversity is a booming field in the biological sciences, because it's really important at this point in time. And it's also something that you can do right at home. You can just whip out a sketch pad and start thinking and designing ways to preserve biodiversity. All you need is a little bit of background knowledge and some creative thinking, and you're ready to start coming up with ways to save the world. I hope you enjoyed this episode on biodiversity, and I hope you learned something worthwhile. I really can't stress enough how important biodiversity is to the health and vitality of our planet, and how important it is to us pragmatically, culturally, and recreationally. We depend on biodiversity for so many things, but because the nature of ecology can be so complex, and the value of biodiversity so nuanced, it's easy for us to overlook it or underestimate its importance. Ideally, we can create a civilization that exists in sustainable harmony with the world around us, preserving and encouraging biodiversity wherever possible. Of course, that depends on how we react to the problems that are caused by climate change, and how we transition our societies to use more sustainable technologies, more sustainable energy sources, and more sustainable agricultural practices. These are all problems that young people and all future generations will have to deal with, so hopefully we're up to the task. And as always, thanks for listening.
Would you like to support the BioLogic podcast? It's super easy. When you open a new episode, press the like button or share it with your friends. If you aren't subscribed, you should hit the subscribe button so you can enjoy a new episode every week. You can also peruse our official store, which has a ton of cool stuff like hand-designed t-shirts, hoodies, and stickers. All the links you need are in the description section below.